Imagine growing up believing your family was normal, until one night you uncover a secret so disturbing it changes everything you thought you knew about your bloodline. This isn't just a story about lies. It's about a girl who discovered that the woman she thought was her aunt was actually her mother. Behind this truth lay a twisted lineage of inbreeding, silence, and horror buried deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Tonight, we'll step into a chilling tale of family secrets, missing persons, and a bloodline cursed by its own choices. If you think you know your family's darkest secret, wait until you hear this one. The story begins in the shadowed hollows of rural West Virginia, where the Appalachian Mountains swallow entire towns in silence. Families here have lived in isolation for centuries, clinging to their traditions and hiding their secrets. Outsiders rarely visit, and when they do, they're met with wary stares and cold politeness that hides something deeper. This is where Emily grew up, or at least, that's what we'll call her. For most of her childhood, she believed she was raised by her grandparents and occasionally cared for by her Aunt Margaret, a woman with sunken eyes, a voice that cracked like old wood, and a constant, unsettling watch over her. To the world, the family was quiet but respectable, working odd jobs and surviving off the land. But behind the locked doors of their cabin, there were whispers Emily was never meant to hear. Her grandparents never allowed her to play with neighborhood kids, and she wasn't permitted to go far into town without someone shadowing her. Emily's world was small. The mountains, the cabin, and the family members who insisted blood was thicker than water. She often asked about her parents, only to be met with silence. The only explanation she was given was that her mother had died young, and her father was never worth mentioning. Over time, Emily stopped asking, but deep down, she sensed something wasn't right. The locals had their suspicions. People whispered about the family's pure bloodline, though no one ever dared to confront them directly. Rumors spread of strange cries echoing through the woods at night, and hunters sometimes reported seeing unfamiliar figures lurking near the family's land. But in towns like this, people minded their business. You didn't dig into another family's secrets, especially not this one. Still, Emily couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something about her identity was being carefully hid. She would sometimes catch Aunt Margaret staring at her in ways that didn't feel like an aunt's love. It felt heavier, almost like a burden. And though Margaret lived only a short walk away, she seemed tied to Emily in a way no one could explain. That tether would soon unravel, revealing a truth darker than anyone in that town could imagine. It was a cold autumn night when the first real crack in Emily's world appeared. She was 12 years old, lying awake in her narrow bed, when she heard footsteps creaking through the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. Too heavy to be her grandmother's. At first, she thought it was her grandfather heading to the kitchen. But when the floorboards groaned, just outside her bedroom door, she froze. Through the faint slit of the door, she saw the shadow of a woman standing still, as if watching her. Emily held her breath, pretending to be asleep. After what felt like hours, the figure finally moved away, and the silence of the cabin returned. But from that night on, she could never sleep without feeling someone was hovering just out of sight. The next morning, Emily asked her grandmother if Aunt Margaret had visited the night before. Her grandmother's face stiffened, and she quickly told Emily not to make up stories. But Emily couldn't shake the image of the woman's shadow. That day at school, one of her classmates whispered something strange to her. "My mama says your aunt ain't your aunt." Emily didn't understand what it meant, and when she tried to press for answers, the girl clammed up, shaking her head in fear. Weeks later, the situation escalated. Emily woke to muffled voices arguing in the kitchen. She crept to the top of the stairs, listening to her grandparents scold Margaret in harsh, panicked whispers. Words like, "People are asking questions and keep her away," floated through the air. Emily's heart pounded. Were they talking about her? When Margaret's voice cut through, it wasn't angry, but desperate. "She deserves to know." That sentence would haunt Emily for years. The next day, a local sheriff's deputy visited the house. He wasn't there long, but Emily overheard just enough to understand he was asking about a missing woman from a nearby county. Her grandparents denied knowing anything, smiling too much, their voices too sweet. After he left, Margaret stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard it rattled the frame. Emily never forgot the look on her grandmother's face as she whispered, almost to herself, "The past is catching up." That was the moment Emily knew something terrible was being hidden. And whatever it was, it had everything to do with her. By the time Emily turned 13, she began noticing the family's strange patterns more clearly. Aunt Margaret wasn't the only one who unsettled her. There were other relatives who drifted in and out of the cabin. They appeared without warning, sometimes staying for days, other times only a night. None of them ever spoke much, and when they did, their voices carried an odd, broken rhythm, like people who hadn't lived around outsiders for decades. Their physical features were even more disturbing. Sunken cheeks, eyes that didn't quite align, swollen jaws, and hands that trembled even when still. The locals whispered about them, but avoided confrontation. To Emily, they weren't visitors, they were family, and that realization made her stomach turn. It was during one of these visits that Emily overheard the most chilling words of her young life. From her room upstairs, she heard Margaret whispering harshly to a man with a twisted gait and vacant stare. "You can't keep showing up here. People are starting to notice. She's asking questions." The man muttered something Emily couldn't catch, but his tone was defensive, almost childlike. When Margaret finally stormed out, Emily peeked through the stairwell and caught sight of him. His face was both familiar and foreign, with unsettling similarities to her own features. For the first time, she wondered if this family was larger and darker than she had ever imagined. The townsfolk weren't blind to it either. Rumors spread of the Hollow family being too close, too private, keeping their bloodline pure in ways that turned stomachs. Parents warned their kids not to wander near the family's land. Hunters claimed they heard eerie laughter echoing from the woods. And once, an old farmer swore he saw two figures that looked almost identical walking side by side, though no one else believed him. Emily's classmates kept their distance. She was the weird one, not because of anything she'd done, but because of the family she came from. She noticed the way adults lowered their voices when she walked by, the pitying looks, and sometimes the fear. It was as though everyone knew a truth about her life that she was still being kept from. And the more she thought about Margaret's watchful eyes and the man with her same jawline, the more she began to dread the answer she was getting closer to uncovering. Curiosity gnawed at Emily like a sickness. By the time she was 14, she had learned to keep quiet, to pretend she didn't notice the strange relatives or the way Margaret hovered over her like a shadow. But inside, she was boiling with questions. Who was she really? Why did the townspeople whisper about her family? And what secret was everyone so desperate to keep buried? One night, unable to sleep, Emily crept downstairs. Her grandparents were already in bed, the cabin silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. She noticed the cellar door, usually bolted shut, was left slightly ajar. A cold draft spilled upward, carrying the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. Heart pounding, Emily lit a candle and descended the creaking steps. The cellar was cluttered with old trunks, broken furniture, and shelves of preserved jars. But what drew her attention was a locked chest, pushed into the far corner. The wood was scarred, its metal latch rusted but sturdy. Emily bent close, running her fingers over the surface, when she noticed faint scratches along the wood. They weren't random. They were words, carved by someone desperate. "Help me." Her breath caught, and she staggered back, almost dropping the candle. Before she could investigate further, she heard footsteps above, quick, heavy, and furious. She barely managed to blow out the light and hide behind a stack of crates before the cellar door creaked open. Margaret descended, holding a lantern. Her face looked more skeletal in the flickering glow, her lips trembling as she muttered to herself. Emily strained to hear, but only caught fragments. "Truth can't. She'll ruin everything." Margaret knelt by the chest, pressing her hands against it, as if guarding it with her very body. Then she whispered words that chilled Emily to her core. "She'll never know who I am. She keep me aunt." Emily stayed frozen until Margaret finally left, the cellar door groaning shut above her. Only then did she dare to breathe. Her hands shook violently, and her mind spun with the implications. Who was Margaret really? And what truth was so terrifying that it had to be locked away, along with desperate cries for help etched into wood? That night, Emily knew one thing for certain. Her family's secrets weren't just whispered rumors. They were real, and they were far darker than she could have ever imagined. The truth came crashing down one stormy evening when Emily, trembling with both fear and determination, confronted Margaret directly. She had been carrying the weight of suspicion for too long, and the cellar discovery had finally pushed her past her breaking point. The rain hammered against the cabin windows as thunder rolled through the mountains. Emily's voice cracked as she demanded, "Who am I really? Why are there secrets about me? What are you hiding?" For the first time, Margaret didn't snap, didn't deflect. Instead, she collapsed into the old rocking chair, her face pale as bone. Her hands shook as she reached for a cigarette she never lit. After a long silence, she finally whispered, "You deserve the truth, even if it destroys you." The words spilled out like poison. Emily's mother wasn't some distant figure who had died young. Her mother was Margaret herself. Margaret had given birth to Emily after a relationship no one dared to speak about, a relationship with her own brother. The very man Emily remembered seeing in the cabin, with her same jawline, was not just a wandering relative. He was her father. The family had hidden it to protect their reputation, to preserve their bloodline, a twisted tradition passed down for generations. Emily felt the world collapse around her. Her stomach churned, her vision blurred, and she shook her head in denial. "You're lying. You're sick." But Margaret only wept, her tears mixing with the smoke of the candlelight. "I didn't want you to know. I wanted you to believe you were normal." The walls of the cabin seemed to close in as the weight of her bloodline pressed on Emily's chest. Every whisper in town, every cruel glance from classmates, every strange resemblance in the faces of those relatives. It all made sense now. She was the living proof of her family's darkest secret. That night, Emily didn't sleep. The storm raged outside, but the real horror was inside her veins. Her life had been built on lies, and her identity was a curse born from a bloodline that should never have existed. And in the silence that followed, another thought crept into her mind. If they had lied about this, what else were they capable of hiding? After Margaret's confession, Emily's world unraveled faster than she could process. For days, she avoided her so-called aunt, now mother, barely speaking, barely eating, her mind consumed with disgust and fear. But things grew darker when Margaret realized Emily wasn't keeping quiet. One evening, Emily overheard her grandparents arguing again, this time with more urgency than ever before. Her grandmother hissed, "If she tells anyone, it will destroy us." Her grandfather's reply was colder. "Then we'll do what we've always done. We'll keep it in the family." Those words chilled Emily's blood. It wasn't just secrecy anymore. It was threat. That night, Emily packed a small bag, just enough food, a flashlight, and the little cash she'd hidden away. Her plan was simple: run into town, find the deputy who had once asked questions, and tell him everything. But as she crept toward the back door, the floorboards betrayed her. A shadow loomed in the hallway. Margaret stood there, her face pale, her eyes wild. "Where are you going?" Margaret's voice cracked, sharp and desperate. Emily froze, clutching her bag to her chest. Margaret stepped closer, her hands trembling, but there was something unhinged in her gaze, like a woman cornered by her own secrets. "You can't leave. You belong here. You're my blood." Emily bolted. She shoved past Margaret, sprinting out into the storm. Rain lashed against her skin as thunder roared through the hollows. Behind her, she heard Margaret screaming her name, the sound twisting with rage and sorrow. Branches whipped at her face as she tore through the woods, following the faint glow of town lights in the distance. But the forest was their territory, not hers. Shadows moved between the trees. Figures, familiar, misshapen, and silent, seemed to emerge from the darkness, watching her, tracking her. Emily stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully, but she pushed forward, heart pounding with pure survival. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just running from secrets. She was running for her life. Emily never remembered exactly how she made it out of those woods. The storm blurred her vision, the ground tore at her knees, and her lungs burned with every breath. But when she finally stumbled onto the main road, collapsing beneath the pale glow of a flickering streetlight, she thought she was safe. A passing trucker found her drenched, bloodied, and half-conscious. He rushed her into town, where the sheriff's office became her refuge. When Emily finally spoke, her story poured out in broken pieces, about Margaret, the chest in the cellar, the carved words, and the confession that shattered her life. The sheriff, visibly shaken, promised to investigate. For a brief moment, Emily felt the crushing weight of her family's secret lifting. But in towns like this, darkness doesn't die easily. The investigation into the Hollow family uncovered fragments of truth, missing persons, unmarked graves in the woods, and connections no one wanted to admit. Yet when the case file reached higher authorities, it was suddenly closed. Insufficient evidence, they said. The family remained untouched, their land untouched, their secrets intact. Margaret disappeared not long after, and the grandparents retreated deeper into isolation. No charges were ever filed. Emily was placed into foster care, eventually leaving the region altogether. On paper, she escaped, but the truth never left her. In every mirror, she saw the resemblance of a man she wished she had never met. In every dream, she heard Margaret's voice whispering, "You belong here. You're my blood." Years later, Emily would return to the Appalachian Mountains, if only to face the ghosts that had followed her across state lines. The cabin was abandoned, its windows shattered, the roof caved in. But as she stood before its rotten frame, the silence of the hollows pressed in on her. Somewhere inside, she swore she heard the faint, shunned creak of footsteps above her, the same way she had all those years ago. Some family secrets can be buried. Others rot in the blood, passed down like a curse. Emily had escaped with her life, but she could never escape her lineage. Because the horror wasn't just in the cabin. It was inside her. Forever.